So Maria, if you want to maybe kick off. Yeah. So welcome everybody to this Sooner, Safer, Happier Pacific community event tonight. My name is Stephen Dowling. I'm one of the community leadership team here. The Sooner, Safer, Happier movement has a mission to help organizations deliver better outcomes and a more humane way of work. And to do that, we want to bring people authentic and inspiring stories to the community to help people to learn and maybe even unlearn and relearn. Before we kick it off, I'd like to just do a quick acknowledgement to country. I'd like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal people who are the traditional owners of the land here in Australia. Here in Melbourne, that is the Wurundjeri people, and we'd like to pay our respects to them, to these elders past, present and emerging. So onto our session this evening, and boy, do we have an exciting one, an interesting one, to talk about the famous Spotify model. So the Spotify model of agility is something I think that's very well known to the agile community. The spark that ignited me, I remember when I was coming on my journey to understand this, there was two amazing YouTube clips that were done by Hendrik Kneiberg. And ever since those came out, I think, the whole community has embraced, in the amazing things that they did there. And everybody's been trying to sort of copy the magic that was created there. We're super lucky to be joined today by Brendan Marsh to share some of his valuable insights on the model. And having spent 5 years at Spotify as a product manager, product owner, agile coach during a hyper growth phase, as a product manager, Brendan was responsible for 1/3 of Spotify's monthly active users. So I think he's highly qualified to give us the real inside track. Brendan is currently an org and a product coach at Organa based here in Melbourne. He's passionate about innovation, product development, continuous improvement, lean startup methods, coaching, leadership, travel, gaming, and esports. Welcome, Brendan. It's great to have you here today with us. And thanks for making the time to come here and share your insights with the community. I think you're going to probably speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So with questions, we would ask people to put them in the chat. And then when it comes to the questions, we'll ask people to actually ask those questions themselves so they can share a bit more context with Brendan for the questions. Just before I hand it over to Brendan, we've got a short little poll, just 2-question poll that we'd love to ask people just to set the scene. So maybe, Maria, if you wouldn't mind raising that one, bring it up. I can do it if you want. Actually, can you do it? Yeah, thanks, Maria. So what does the Spotify model represent to you? And then the second one, does your organization use any of the Spotify terminology, squads, strides, chapters, skills? Okay, I'll need you to share, Maria. Yeah, I've seemed to have lost my co-host.
Yeah, that's okay. We've got about 86 that responded, so I think that's good enough to give a go. So I'll end it now.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, so you see, yeah, very interesting. 37% saying a good case study having agility. Yeah, interesting, Brendan. Okay, I'll hand it over to you, Brendan, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. Hey, everyone. My name's Brendan. As Stephen mentioned, I worked at Spotify for about 5 years. First couple of years were as an agile coach, working in the basement with data infrastructure, and then the following 3 years working with Spotify's desktop client as a product manager. what's interesting about this topic for me is I too was very much inspired by that original Spotify scaling agile document that did the rounds in 2012, I think it was, because I joined the company in 2013, and a big part of my motivation to join them was very much being inspired by that document. So it's been really interesting to join the company, then see really how the sausage is made, and then go away from Spotify, and during that time watch the world get captivated with this model, and then come back to Australia eventually after 6.5 years in Sweden, and seeing, especially working as a consultant where I get to meet lots of different companies, seeing so many companies talk about squads and chapters and tribes. Seeing 68% in that poll was absolutely mind-blowing to me. Back in the day, I remember it just being like you'd hear about a company like, say, ANZ or ING in Europe, and you'd go, oh wow, they actually like copied that. Oh my goodness, I wonder what that must have been like. To now just hearing it everywhere and sort of almost being in like maximum cognitive dissonance as to how on earth did that happen. But today I'm going to talk about, do I think the model was successful? Was it successful? I believe it was. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why I thought it was successful, but also why it might not be successful for you or the company that you're working for. And also a little bit about what didn't work so well as well. So a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I worked as a coach and a product manager at Spotify. If you've ever used Spotify for Mac or Windows, that was my baby for a number of years. Eventually, after 5 years at the company, I moved on to working for a mental health nonprofit startup called 29K as chief product officer. And now I pretty much take everything I've learned from these experiences and try and teach and coach companies around everything from product management to org design to agile, high performing teams, all that kind of stuff. And some of the clients and experiences you can see up on the screen.
Sorry.
So yeah,
sorry, Brendan, do you see the slides? I don't see the slides. Are they sharing? Can
oh my goodness.
Yeah, just thanks.
Fantastic.
Man,
thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Goodness, that's hilarious. That's a good start. At least I haven't shared any other screens other than the one that you're looking at now, so that's good. Thank you. So yeah, as I was talking about, I kind of see that I have a bit of a unique position of having both worked as a coach and as a product manager. Wait, are you? Yeah, you should be seeing the like picture of me on stage and all that stuff, right? Just to double check. Okay, thumbs up, awesome. Throughout, so when I joined, it was about a year after that paper was written. And from that point onwards, the company just exploded in size in terms of user growth and in terms of the number of people at the company. And I left not too long, maybe about a year or so after they went public. So I really think I got to see that model exists fairly similar to its original sort of stated form, and then change and grow and evolve over the time that I was there. And just for context, when I joined, Spotify had just launched in the US. They had about 600 employees, half of which were active in developing the product. And by the time I'd left, there were about 4,000 employees. Again, with roughly about half of them helping to build the product. I'm curious, has anyone seen the Playlist? The Netflix series? It was really interesting I haven't watched all of it yet, but it was really interesting to see some of the kind of tech side of things in the very, very early days, in the first like 16 engineers. But speaking of things, whether you might have seen or not seen, has anyone seen this article? This failed squad goals one might have did the rounds a little while ago. Yes, it's got the very clickbaity title. Spotify doesn't use the Spotify model, and neither should you. In this article, Jeremiah argues that the model was a failure. That Spotify doesn't even use it, and that companies like Fitbit that utilize, for example, Safe is a better option. I'm just going to start out by saying this guy was at the company less than a year, and many years after the original article that blew up and went viral. A huge number of people that I deeply respect that were there much longer than I was, some of which helped leadership positions, some of which actually helped shape the model in the beginning, pretty much dismiss this article for what it's worth, as do I to some extent. He's made some good points in it, and I think some of his points are valid, but I'd argue that the fundamental framing of this article is just wrong, and a weird way of putting it, actually. Yeah, what's frustrating about this article is that Spotify coaches for years have been coming out and saying really sensible stuff that's kind of less interesting than a clickbaity title like this, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't blindly copy the model. It's different now to what it was described back then. It has its challenges. We haven't figured everything out, et cetera, et cetera. But these kind of statements, unfortunately, aren't all that interesting to a lot of people. This kind of thing is way more interesting. Oh my God, what if we got it wrong all this time? You know, it's kind of like someone saying, oh, I tried Scrum once and it didn't work. It leaves you with more questions than answers, in my view. But my take is that I think the Spotify model was successful, but to really rationalize this, we have to understand why this model was created in the first place. And to really understand the why, we need some context. So 2000, let's go back to 2011. In 2011, the company knew pretty much that Apple and Google and potentially Amazon were likely working on competitor apps. This was going to create some challenges for us. Apple were probably going to slowly move away from iTunes and create a streaming music service, which they did. Google already had YouTube, which was technically a competitor, but we guessed they were also likely working on a competitive product as well. And we kind of heard that Amazon were too. And turns out, of course, all these predictions came true. This presented a unique challenge. How the hell do we compete with these massive gorillas in the room? Because it's going to be hard to compete with them. Firstly, I don't know if you know much about their financials, but they have an enormous amount of money. Apple, Google, and Amazon are just completely flush with cash. If they wanted to launch a very similar music streaming service, they could just half the cost of premium, and theoretically, we could just be dead in the water, right? They could afford to hemorrhage more money than us just to get all of our customers, for example. They also could compete with us on hiring and top talent, because most of their offices are in the US. They can pay bigger salaries than we could. Their stock option programs are better than ours, especially because Sweden's taxes are really high. So if you even just buy your stock options in Sweden, for example, you get taxed as if it's personal income, which means you can go from being on 30 to 40% to suddenly 62% in a year, just because you decided to exercise some options, even though you haven't actually sold them. So that's challenging. They also have the platform advantage. So with Google and Apple, they can just come along and go, they can just put their product front and center in iOS and Android, potentially when you buy a new phone, or even in a software upgrade. We can't do that, right? And lastly, I think what we realized is that if you've got enough money, software engineers, and lawyers, you can start a music streaming service. So we basically had this feeling that music streaming is going to become a commodity. Every company is going to be able to do this soon, and they can just copy what we've done. There's nothing massively unique about talking to the major labels, getting licenses to their music, and creating a streaming service where you can play any song, album, artist in the world easily. You can stream them. So that's kind of where we were in 2011. And so what that meant was this was our product strategy in response to those market conditions. The first is called indefensible product differentiation. So what this means is Spotify was first to market with a music streaming service, particularly one where you can get music for free that's supported by ads. And the free service was basically the funnel to the paid service. What this strategy means is that we need to take this first mover advantage and continuously give our customers a reason to stick with us versus to go off and use one of these competitors. So we'd already beaten them to the punch in the market. But if they catch up and they kind of match our feature set, then of course they could just cannibalize the cost of the service. So what that means is we need to find ways to be really innovative and keep giving our customers reasons to use us over them. So we need to differentiate our product in the eyes of the customers. But we also acknowledge, and why it's called indefensible, is every time we differentiate it, they can just copy whatever we've done. It will take them time to copy what we've done, but they can copy what we've done. So we actually don't necessarily have a strong defensible differentiation. So what this means is we just need to be really fast, and we need to innovate heavily all the time. The second one is the likes, especially companies like Apple, they really like to create wall gardens around their ecosystem. So, for example, you could buy one of those Apple speakers and you might not be able to play other kinds of streaming music services on them, or, Apple's done a lot of this in the past. So one advantage we have is we can say, hey, we're everywhere. If you're with Spotify, we're in your car, we're on your speakers, we're on every single kind of device. If you think about Microsoft had a music streaming service once back in the day called Groove, and it was heavily integrated into all the Microsoft products, but the experience you're going to get on a different platform is going to be subpar or non-existent, for example. So we had the advantage of being, well, we're not a hardware company, right? We can be everywhere. And part of this product differentiation was this concept of the right music for every moment. And what that meant was we looked into our customer data. How are people using the product? And what we realized was that we were seeing a shift from people listening to albums in a kind of a library mechanic. So I go to the library and or go to a music store, for example, and I pick out an album that I want to listen to, or I go, I want to listen to that particular artist. That's sort of a library mentality, to I want to create a really amazing playlist around working out, around running, around hosting a dinner party, around hosting a rave, whatever that looks like. I want music that's going to enhance my experience when I do something. Fun fact, one of the most popular playlists on Spotify is the Focus playlist. So the music that's this really boring, non-lyrical playlist of music that's great to focus while you're doing work, for example. That's by far one of the most popular playlists on the platform. So we realized we can use this advantage that we have with all the data that we've accumulated for how our customers are using the product, and use that to enhance the experience of the product, the right music for every moment. Which, yeah, is a nice segue to this one, personalization and data. So we realized that, the more data that we have on how customers use the product, the more we can personalize the experience, the more we can provide recommendations, eventually stuff like, Discover Weekly and so on. And we can really use machine learning to provide a really awesome personalized experience. And we can use that data to inform our decisions in the product. So we can have a really amazing product insights team, for example, that helps product managers make really good decisions around how to build a better product. And it's going to take some time for our competitors to catch up in terms of the amount of usage data that they're going to have. And then finally, we also realized at the time, because we hadn't launched in the US yet, we really need to launch in the US. We really need to capitalize on the US market, because that's going to be pivotal to being seen as a worldwide, well-known consumer-facing brand. So it's super duper important that we absolutely win in the US market. And this was these points are basically Spotify's product strategy from back then. This is how we could compete. So, at this point, the company, way back in the beginning, had just 60 employees in research and development, for example. And the CTO was being told by investors and advisors, you're probably going to need to grow your engineering, product, and design organization to over 1,000 people that are going to be distributed between the US and Sweden, in order to be able to scale product development, to be able to achieve these really, really ambitious goals. So how do we make this product strategy a reality in terms of our org design and our culture? Ultimately, the most important question is, what are we trying to optimize for? So in my mind, with this product strategy, there are fundamentally 3 things that we needed to optimize for in terms of how we scale and grow our organization. First and foremost, if the only thing we can compete with our competitors on is being first to market with innovative new features and keep giving our customers a reason to choose us over Apple or Google, then we needed to be very fast, and not just fast at delivering, but fast at learning, or for example, fast at making mistakes, trying new things and seeing what sticks. In fact, Daniel Ek, the CEO and founder, would many times get up on stage and say, I want Spotify to make more mistakes than any other company in the world. And not only would he just say that, but he would also back that up and say, by the way, here's a mistake I made last week. Here's what I learned from that mistake. So he'd truly embody these things and not just say them for the sake of saying them. So, we needed to be fast, and this was a really important principle. Secondly, experimentation. So it's not enough to be fast. We could be really fast at delivering the wrong things. So the other thing we would hear him say is, we need to make more mistakes than any other company in the world. Or he'd say stuff like, the next great idea for the company likely won't come from me. It will come from you. So in order to truly innovate, we needed to optimize for a culture of rapid experimentation and learning. We're trying to disrupt a damn industry over here. We don't have time to be a lumbering bureaucratic organization. We needed to try many things, fail often, and find those nuggets that were going to help us keep ahead of the competition. And finally, scale. So of course we need to be fast, and of course we need to make lots of mistakes, but we're also trying to achieve those things whilst hiring like absolute crazy in our organization. So if we are to truly be a ubiquitous product that is for example, that's on all of your devices, it's on your speakers, in your car, on all of, iOS, Android, desktop, everywhere. If we are to have a rich data strategy that informs our decisions and drives personalization, if we are to ensure that our product teams are able to move fast, we're going to need to hire a metric shit ton of people, right? That was just really obvious that we were going to need to grow quite fast, and we had luckily the investment funds to be able to do so as well. Not every company has that. If you think practically about the kind of pieces of work that we took on to enable that scale, design systems, infrastructure, CI/CD, data infrastructure, hardware integrations, developer tooling, accessibility, language support, all of these things enable us to grow and scale really quickly without kind of slowing down to a halt. hell, even just complying with music licensing regulations in each market is an absolute minefield. We needed to hire so many people, and we sure as hell didn't want this to come at the cost of our speed. We were about to be a beast. And like I said in the beginning, we grew from 600 to 4,000 in just 5 to 6 years. So speed, experimentation, and scale. So coming back to what we're optimizing for, we felt that we needed to optimize for a high degree of autonomy. Autonomy lets the people closest to the problem figure out how to best solve it the quickest. Autonomy creates room for innovation. So did the Spotify model work? Well, yeah, absolutely. It was built for purpose. It was built for the market context that I just mentioned. It was built to help us try and achieve that product strategy. But there's also so much to this, model that isn't part of that original article either. Unlike some agile scaling models, this model scaled horizontally, not vertically. And it really didn't prescribe to teams how they should work. It was designed to keep a culture of speed innovation whilst continuing to grow really fast. And, we acknowledged this trade-off. So we were high autonomy and low alignment. We certainly weren't high alignment, low autonomy. And we acknowledged that we weren't high autonomy, high alignment either. Although we would like to get to that point, at the time, it was almost a badge of honor. We're not going to be able to achieve the level of innovation and speed that we need if we are focused on trying to make sure, everyone is working on exactly the right thing in the organization that's aligned with some, top level hierarchical place that we want to get to. Chaos was kind of a part of the system in a way. So to break this down a little bit better, how did it help us achieve speed? You can see I've kind of referenced some of the sooner, safer, happier concepts here. So for example, teams weren't expected to do Scrum. For example, they were expected to be agile and continuously improve. Kanban, Scrum, Scrumban, Franken Scrum, take your pick. Don't care what way of working you use, just as long as you're being agile. Just ensure you focus on moving fast and continuously improving. The only intervention, for example, that us as coaches would make would be if a team wasn't doing regular retrospectives, for example. If they didn't have a mechanism in place to reflect on their work and how they're improving, then we would go, what's going on here? Are you having conversations about how to improve and how can we help? Can we give you some tools to help you have meaningful conversations about how to move fast? That was really the only unacceptable lack of process from us. And what's sometimes frustrating is this doesn't really get talked about when people riff on the Spotify model, is this real culture of choose the right way of working that really suits you. And so, yeah, I would sum it up as, minimum viable agile practices. A key part of what I think helped this work well was agile coaches as a role, not Scrum Masters. Scrum Masters basically didn't exist. But coaches were hired into the tribes, and their job was to help teams move towards becoming high performing first and foremost. Second to that is work on the system outside of the squad. If the system is not conducive to the teams being high performance. So as I mentioned before, speed was just so damn important. And so our job was to basically give teams the tools to move as fast as they can, to learn as fast as they can. Centering teams and squads around missions, around solving a business problem. There were no such thing as a BAU team. That basically just didn't exist. There's a real radical accountability around how the teams were set up. Each team knew exactly what parts of the code base and software systems that they owned and were responsible for maintaining. And that also includes killing off things if they're not useful anymore. When I took over at least the infrastructure layer of desktop, one of the first projects that my team worked on was killing off a large piece of infrastructure that no one used anymore. An absolute allergy to bureaucracy. Like, I've never been in an organization before that was so allergic to rules. And, you know, rules can be great. If you're a fan of Kanban, making policies explicit is really great, but the rules need to make sense. And so if something came down from HR, from tech leadership, whatever that might look like, and it says everyone has to do X, Y, Z. Now, classic example, CTO once thought it would be a good idea to say, I want everyone to measure cycle time. And that went down like a lead balloon, and pretty much no one did it. So we're very allergic to bureaucracy. And yeah, having squads and tribes specifically dedicated, their mission is to improve developer productivity, was also really helpful for speed. I just realized I'm really behind time. I'm going to speed up a bit. So, for example, one example was, this was a article in our internal blog post that the CTO wrote just after I joined, and it was about how he saw the agile coach role, and it was all about speed. If you look at the first sentence, speed is at the heart here, right? Our job, like I mentioned before, is to help empower teams to move as fast as they possibly can. And there were not enough of us for every team, so we had to go where the need was greatest. All right, so how did it help innovation? This culture of failure as being seen as learning, combined with having slack time in the system, I think it helped enormously. Teams didn't just have autonomy in how they work, they have autonomy in what they work on, which enables innovation. If someone from outside the team is saying you have to do X or Y, if you're like, your job is to build feature X, then how could you possibly expect innovation to occur? This culture of failure as learning was driven all the way from the top. Daniel Ek on stage, I want us to make more mistakes than any other company in the world, saying it and backing it up with like embodying that and sharing examples of times he'd made mistakes. Hack weeks and hack days were quite common, give people the space to really innovate, and heavy investment in making data available to everyone so that anyone could try something, ship it, and look at the data to see if it was successful. Agile coaches, like I said before, they weren't Scrum police. We taught lean, for example, lean ways of cheaply validating assumptions, lean canvases, design sprints, hypothesis creation, assumption mapping. My first team that I coached at Spotify was the A/B testing infrastructure team. The company took this stuff super duper seriously. And we didn't just experiment on the product, we experimented with how we worked. I remember one hack week, Daniel Ek was like, I'm really interested in holacracy, and I want to go off and learn a little bit about that and see if any of these ideas are applicable to how we work. Yeah. And here's some really, one of my favorite examples of this in action. Has anyone here ever used Discover Weekly before? It's, yeah, see a few hands up. It's one of the most successful features that the company has ever shipped. And fun fact, it came about from a small team whose mission it was to experiment with personalization. And you might be surprised to hear this, but at first, Daniel, the CEO and founder, was actually not impressed by this idea. In fact, he said if it was, quote, up to him, he would have killed it, which blows my freaking mind. Like, I love this story because it's an example of when the rubber meets the road, when the most important person in the company, the hippo, sees your idea and think it's crap, he's still allowing it that breathing room to see if it could be successful. So I think I love this example because basically they presented it to him. He didn't like it, but he said, look, I'm not going to give you any more funding for this. In other words, I'm not going to give you any more people to work on it. But if you want to pursue it, that's your prerogative. And so they did, and they tested it on employees. They tested it on a small percentage of customers. And employees and customers absolutely loved this feature, and it became one of the most successful features that the company has ever made. And it shaped product strategy from that point onwards to double down on machine learning, data, and it spun off a whole bunch of other really great personalization-based features. And finally, how did this model actually help scale? We used to joke sometimes that as agile coaches, our job says that we're trying to create high-performing teams, but in reality, actually, we're just trying to cope. We're just trying to help teams cope with the constant growth. Soften the blow of constant growth, basically. So our mantra was to hire on potential, and we had really great onboarding processes. And it was to hire on potential because, as we mentioned before, we couldn't compete with the big companies offering this big salary package, sign-on bonuses, big stock option programs. Couldn't compete with that. So instead, we had to hire people that were really smart and good at what they did, but they're not the superstars that go off to those other companies. We actually needed to create an environment where those people could learn and thrive. And so that's why the chapter lead model existed, because it's focused on competency growth, right? It's focused on sharing knowledge. When I see really mature companies go, oh, we need chapter lead models, it's like, well, and if they're hiring people that are already really good at what they're doing, is that really the thing you want to optimize for example? Each tribe was really responsible for their onboarding processes, but there were these other processes that existed, like intro days and boot camp, and we had a whole team called people operations, which was separate from HR, who were there to help us with problems like this. We used to talk a lot about speed to productive. When someone joins the company, how long does it take them to get productive? Like I mentioned, 2-week boot camps for new employees, intro days for anyone that joins the company in any department, where they get to hear the story of the company from Daniel and Martin, which is pretty cool. Buddy programs. And then finally, also another part I don't think it gets talked much about is a lot of the CTO's time was not spent really on technology. It was spent on growing a leadership team to be able to cope with this scale, to be able to really effectively embody these agile leadership principles to grow great managers and chapter leads that are going to help create a really healthy, high-functioning, high-performing organizations. That's what the CTO really was focused on, rather than championing some platform roadmap or some big, massive architecture shift. Of course, he got involved in those things, but he was optimizing for how do we scale our engineering organization. This model was also really super motivating. We had really great staff retention because it mapped to Dan Pink's intrinsic motivations. When you think about it, like the product owner is really focused on giving people a purpose, a why. The agile coach is focused on autonomy. How do I help this team move fast and own their own ways of working? And the chapter lead's focused on mastery. So back to my 3 points from before: speed, experimentation, scale. The model is optimized to support the company's product strategy. It also helps a lot that the company was agile from the very beginning. There was no transformation effort. The company was Scrum teams from the very, very beginning. So, whilst I'm working there in the thick of it all, I hear that all these companies from around the world are copying this model, or they're interested in copying it. And so often my question to these executives at these companies were, are you a rapidly scaling startup trying to disrupt an industry that needs to focus on these things? Because the answer is no, this might not be for you. Or sometimes if we were feeling a bit cheeky, we would say, are you a music streaming service? And more importantly, are you willing to forego predictability, control, long-term planning, project budgeting, resource allocation, yada, yada, yada? Are you willing to let go of all those things? Because in some ways, this isn't really a model for scale. It's a model for unscale. What are all the things we're not going to do? And we just didn't do a lot of the things that big enterprise companies do. We just didn't do them from the beginning. So we're blessed with that. We don't have all those things to basically hit the undo button on. If you think back to the agile principles, simplicity, the art of work not done, really embodies its way of working, right? There was no budgeting other than how many people are we hiring into each of these organizations for the most part. But, wasn't all roses either. Large scale initiatives were a mess. We used to say we suck at projects. The chapter lead role, whilst it served its purpose for a while, was eventually scrapped. It was a really difficult role to get right because you needed someone to be a really good line manager, a really good leader, but also know enough about their competency space to be able to help foster that growth of people. And then somehow manage their time, because 10 people in their chapter are in 10 different teams. So how on earth do you get the context from all of those 10 teams in order to be a great coach and leader to those people? It's damn near impossible. So it was that role itself really, really struggled. It was often a very chaotic place to be. Lots of duplication of effort. So you might learn that a team somewhere else on the other side of the company is working on the same problem as you. That's fun. Lots of lack of standardization. So I remember when I walked into desktop, I quickly learned that apparently there was 10 different ways to write unit tests, which was kind of mind-blowing, because if you needed to make sense of that somehow and do any sort of heuristics on the quality of the testing, forget it. So that was quite difficult. Probably a result of somewhat too much autonomy, you could argue. Many of the roles had existential crises. So sometimes as agile coaches, we'd ask ourselves, how the hell do you measure whether we're successful at this role? I'm sure some of you can relate to that one. Communication was messy as hell, noisy as hell, lots of different ways to communicate, lots of different tools. And also the guilds got quite a bit out of control. So eventually, as we grew really big, it wasn't uncommon for half the team to be missing at guild unconferences, and people going, where is so-and-so? And where's so-and-so? And where's so-and-so? Oh, they're at the back-end guild unconference. Oh, the front-end guild unconference, the agile unconference. Maybe this isn't working so well. So leadership had to rein that one in a little bit. So the point, I suppose I'm trying to get across, all these decisions were trade-offs, right? Trade-offs that means something gets neglected, but it was all still fine because the fundamental principle of continuous improvement remained. All these problems had to be solved eventually. So why doesn't it work for whatever company is using this? And look, the simple answer is context. The Spotify model was built for Spotify's unique market conditions. And yes, we did derive insights and copy ideas from other companies. We did that too. But we copied them to solve a problem that we had, not just because it was the vogue thing to do at the time. Not to mention, we were agile from the beginning. We were in a Swedish culture of consensus egalitarianism, which in Sweden they call Jante. If anyone has watched the Spotify series, you might remember at the beginning Daniel saying, the engineers are the star of the show, right? That mentality was there from the beginning. Can you imagine, and really sorry if anyone works for these companies, but can you imagine the ANZs of the world having their CEO going, the engineers are the star of the show, and then follow through with behaviors that embody that kind of mentality? I'd love to see it if that's true. But this model, if you truly embody it, not just the PDF description of it, but the true nature and culture of it, is actually quite extreme compared to most companies of that scale. To suggest that a huge enterprise company with millions of policies and procedures, with big egos and leadership, can really adopt this way of working and have it be successful, honestly kind of baffled me over this time. And hey, kudos to any big company that truly wants to focus on this level of innovation and speed and scale in this way. But to half-ass it is to fundamentally like not do it, is to not change. And that's what I think a lot of companies have done. They've given their existing behaviors and structures a new lick of paint by calling stuff tribes and squads, but without the same context, without the same culture, and without the same diehard commitment to continuous improvement. My favorite part of the culture there had to be that anyone in the company was encouraged to challenge the status quo and to ask why to any leader all the way up to the CEO. Why are we doing this? There were no sacred cows. People would ask, why aren't salaries transparent? Why are we paying enough money to music? Like, are we paying enough music royalties? Social issues, HR policies, everything was debatable. This way of working absolutely needs to be not only supported, but embodied at the very, very top. And this was at Spotify, both by the CEO and the chairman of the board, both of which are founders of the company. Oh my goodness, that took a lot longer than I thought it would. That's my talk.
No, awesome. Absolutely brilliant, Brendan. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Really, really, really excellent. We've had this, thanks everybody for those questions that we've had in the chat. So I'm going to try and pick a few. Brendan, we mightn't get to all of them, but there was one there initially, like you were saying that, and I think Maria, the one you were talking about, you know, was there any kind of measures, like obviously you had those things, you know, go quickly, speed, experimentation. Did you have measures and metrics that you knew? Or sorry, Maria, I'll let you ask that one. Yeah.
No, that you've done it, Stephen. Any outcomes measures, like anything quantified to show how the model worked, so to speak, Brendan?
Not other than the fundamental performance of the product, I would say. You know, yeah, we had like pirate metrics, acquisition, retention, activation, that sort of thing. But most attempts to assess that sort of thing were qualitative. I think there was an understanding that quantitatively assessing speed might cost more time to do that than it's worth doing it in the first place. I've seen so many attempts to try and quantitatively assess how fast an organization can run, but that misses the point of like, are they even delivering the right things? And to try and assess both of those things, you kind of can only really assess whether the outcomes were successful, like the end product outcomes that teams are working on. So that was just a constant conversation in product and engineering leadership. Are we achieving the things we're trying to achieve? No, you know, have we met our deadlines? No, you know, any of that sort of thing. It's just, are we winning in the market? Are we delighting our customers? You know, have we moved consumption of music on a daily basis? Is our monthly active users going up? How's our churn? Yada, yada, yada. That's the conversation that leadership are having. And then the tribes and squads are vehicles to solve those problems. So then locally in the tribes, they will say, does it look like our teams are moving as fast as they can? I don't know, let's ask the teams, right? So there's an enormous amount of trust built in. And I've always been a little bit allergic to, you know, heuristics around speed of productivity, because there's something about it that just feels a little bit gamifiable. Yeah. So short answer, not really, but different kind of conversations.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Brendan. And there was a couple of questions there I noticed, and thanks, Luke Chandler. Do you want to come off mute and just, if there's, you had a couple of questions there for Brendan in the chat.
Oh, did I? I have to remember what they were. Scroll back up.
No worries. No, I just, yeah. So we had, yeah.
Here we go.
I had a couple. Just.
I think,
so,
yeah.
Sorry,
Stephen, do you want me to ask the question?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I was just keen to find out, Brenda, did you have any insights into how Spotify converted some of the sort of the Napster or the torrenters to Spotify? Because you spoke about the Google and Amazon and Apple and trying to play that, but how do we convert the market to become paid users?
I suppose that was kind of the even earlier strategy, I suppose, was because they were operating in Sweden. Sweden's piracy was absolutely rampant and the government weren't doing anything about it. So that's kind of the first profile of customers they had, were people that were pirating music because there was no money being spent on music. And I can say I was one of those people too. And the way I would pitch Spotify to my friends was, it's easier and better than pirating music. How they went about that, I think, was having a free product that was ad supported. So that the ease of use of listening to ad-based music was still mildly better than pirating. But then you would get annoyed with the ads after a while, and if you had the money, you would pay for it. So I would say they used to talk about the free funnel being like a large pool of fish from which the premium side of the business can fish from. And that was the way of thinking about the conversion funnel, was how do we create a product that pulls in as many free users as we possibly can, and it's good enough to get them to stick around long enough to convert to premium.
Cool.
I don't know any like nitty gritty tactics that they did to do that, but that was conceptually. And for what it's worth, Maria and Stephen, I can stick on a little bit longer if people have questions.
Cool. And there's one, I think you mentioned as well, Brendan, actually there's a question here from James Fletcher about, how bigger projects were done at Spotify. I'll let you, James, if you want to jump in.
Well, yeah, I actually asked that question, Brendan, before you got to your challenges, saying that there was a mess. So that was almost validating in a way to hear. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, at first, it was done in a messy way of like, let's just get all the people that need to talk together in a room to sort of plot out what needs to be done. But eventually, I would say the way that they got around that was a company level portfolio Kanban board, where it had a WIP limit of 10. So the company would only work on 10 large scale initiatives at any point in time. And that was updated on a quarterly basis with 2-week feedback cycles around any teams blocked on any other teams in being able to achieve what they're trying to achieve. Sometimes those initiatives were a lot more defined. For example, company moving off data centers onto GCP, Google Cloud Platform. Sometimes they're a bit more outcome driven. So we need to achieve a certain, what was a good example of that? Might be like a growth metric outcome, or we need to launch in a particular market and there's a bit of unclarity around how we're going to achieve that. Or launch on PlayStation, for example, is another one. So these are all big initiatives that required lots and lots of cross-functional attention from not only tech, product and design, but from outside of those organizations as well. And it was just, sometimes the coaches would help, set up rhythms and cadences that were going to work for those different departments to collaborate around achieving a particular result. There wasn't a one size fits all approach to those things.
There's a question here from Ronald around Slack time. Ronald, do you want
to? Try to remember, but you talked about Slack time, how important it was, but you also talked about speed and the pressure to deliver. How did those two things balance? Because typically you see that Slack is then being sacrificed in the interest of delivering stuff.
Yeah. To reiterate, it wasn't just speed of delivery, it's also speed of learning. So sometimes you need to, I suppose you could maybe look at the context of speed in like how many things are in your way of moving as fast as you can, rather than how fast are we moving. Maybe that's a subtle nuance here. Like trying to understand what are the things that slow us down was more of a common conversation than how can we move faster than we already are, if that makes sense. So it's more about removing impediments to speed rather than the speed itself. Hack Week was the whole company once or twice a year. And it was up to each tribe and squads within reason to figure out what their sort of Slack day commitment, if you will, was. Sometimes in my area, we had 2 days a month. Some other teams would have 1 day of a sprint. And these were just really great opportunities, not just for innovation, but to like pay down tech debt, to automate something that's currently manual, whatever that looks like. I think that was generally expected as something that teams should be doing. So maybe the answer to your question is it's speed in the space outside of the Slack. If that makes sense.
There's a coaching related one here from Dev. I think, because like you talk about the caliber of the people that you have and the autonomy that's given. Dev, do you want to ask that question about if we don't have a performing squad?
Yeah, sure.
Dev?
Hey, buddy. Brendan, great session. Man.
Nice to see.
So my question is, do you have an example of when the environment a squad was in was not conducive to high performance? And you mentioned that that's often what the coaching interventions were about. So what was a coaching intervention? What did that look like in that case?
A precursor to that would be the agile coach, the product owner or manager, depending on which part of history you look at, and the chapter lead. Yeah, the chapter lead, the agile coach, and the product manager would usually meet once every 2 weeks to discuss the health of the team. And we called that the potluck, product owner, team lead, agile coach. It's kind of a play on of potluck. That meeting was to try and identify any systemic problems in the team that might need addressing somehow. And maybe that would be addressed through chapter lead having one-on-ones with certain people. Maybe it would be achieved with agile coach leaning in. Maybe it's a feedback workshop. Maybe it's like structuring a particular type of retrospective to get people to realize certain things. It really greatly differed. And sometimes it might be putting a member of a team on a performance improvement plan because they were behaving in a toxic way or something. But I think the key point is we had that feedback loop every 2 weeks to really sit down and talk about. We're not talking about projects, we're not talking about the products, we're not talking about any of that sort of stuff. We're talking about the health of the team. What are we seeing, and how can we, the question that we would ask in every single one of those meetings is how can we help the team succeed? And that might lead to some of those conversations and opportunities to lean in.
Great stuff. Listen, we've just hit the hour, so I'm just conscious of time. And I know you've generously said you'll hang on, but I think for those people who are going to drop off, just a huge thanks, Brendan. I think this has been an absolutely fantastic session. I've taken away absolutely some really gold nuggets. It's been absolutely brilliant. So just thanks everybody for attending. And I think we're going to be sending out, there's a standard survey that's going to come out after this. So we'd really appreciate you to get your feedback. And I think we've got a Slack channel as well, Maria, isn't it? If we don't get time to answer all of the questions, that please put them in there and I'm sure we'll be able to come back to them. So just a huge thanks to everybody for attending the session today. And yeah, I think, do you want to hang around for a few minutes for an extra 5 minutes if anybody has any other final questions? Maybe, Brandon, if you're good with